To call most games from 1978 uninteresting may seem a bit unfair, but today we're looking at Skydiver, pretty much the most 1978 game of all time. High concepts and characters and stories really weren't possible at the time, especially when most games had a joystick and one button. Initially an arcade release, Skydiver would also have an Atari 2600 release for homes. While information on the game is extremely limited, it has seen some releases since its initial releases. Atari Anthology on PC, Xbox, and PS2 included the 2600 version. Game Room, an arcade emulation service for Xbox 360, also had the Atari 2600 version, and Atari Flashback Classics for Switch, Xbox One, and PS4 includes both versions, and it's how I played them for this video. There's probably more obscure releases, but nobody cares enough to easily document all of them for me, so I'm not even gonna try. Skydiver is extremely simple. The arcade version has a stick and two buttons. A plane comes from either side of the screen. The game seems to be mostly designed for multiplayer, but can be played as a single-player score-based game. One button causes you to go flying out of your plane like a bullet, one opens the parachute, and the player can steer left and right in the air. In case the name wasn't clear enough, this is a game about parachuting. The goal is to drop on targets that shift position every loop. Missing a platform or failing to open the parachute costs a life. The game goes on until the player loses all 3 lives. To add to the complexity a bit, with each drop the wind can change direction and strength. It's actually fairly impressive for the time, and the visual of the windsock to indicate it is relatively clever. The player also gains more points the lower they open the parachute, which also causes the target to shrink, giving some amount of risk reward for getting scores. Safety builds points slowly, going hard runs a greater risk of losing lives. That sums it up. You drop dudes until you miss 3 times, and then you do it again. It's tolerable, it's not a mind-blowing loop or anything, and it has a tendency to be kinda bullshit. The planes come in and out pretty fast, and in bad wind conditions, landing can be difficult if not straight up impossible. It's an okay mini-game, like you'd see in, I don't know, the Kingdom Hearts 3 mini-games, but it's not much more than that in the slightest. Visually, the game is of its time. Plain blue sky, plain black plane, plain little dude. The plane is well drawn for the limitations, and there's a tiny bit of animation when opening the parachutes. It's okay enough. I mean, you have to keep in mind this was 3 years before Donkey Kong. Tech moved pretty fast after this point. The sound is horrid. The intro song is a serviceable, like, 2-second jingle, but the other noise is just droning bleeps. The ambulances that come to rescue crashed drivers let out the most irritating sound imaginable. A worse punishment than losing a life, even if they are a cute detail, but they also break the pace some by taking for fucking ever to pick you up. Does this game have any kind of legacy? Not really, no. So to conclude, it's a game, it's a serviceable distraction for maybe 5 minutes. I wouldn't recommend it. It feels like a mid-tier Mario Party game, and it comes from an era slightly before games had some ability to not come out of the other side horribly dated. The Atari 2600 is much weaker than the arcade games of the era, but despite the much weaker hardware, it's arguably a more interesting version of the game. There's not really a lot more to say about it. It's still a game where you jump guys out of a plane. The core gameplay is identical, although opening the parachute is now done by pressing down on the joystick because, it's a one-button controller, but the rules have changed a bit. Instead of having 3 lives, the player always has 9 drops. The goal is only score here, not trying to survive, likely because of the increased multiplayer focus this conversion has. The Atari 2600 has a weird feature that isn't discussed often, mainly because people don't care for the console for pretty good reason. Physical switches on the console that flip bytes and change things in the games. There are 3 switches, one for each of the 2 players and one main switch. The 2-player switches adjust the speed of the plane, with the secondary mode slowing down either player independently, making a sort of optional easy mode. The main switch adjusts the targets. By default it works just like the arcade, with targets on the ground that are in slightly different positions for each pass, although here they don't shrink as you freefall. Mode 2 makes the target smaller. Mode 3 makes it move but eliminates wind, presumably because it's hard enough to land with them moving, let alone wind, although it's possible both was impossible on the console anyway due to technical limitations. Mode 4 is small moving targets if you really want to suffer, and Mode 5 is the most interesting, skydiving chicken. There's only one target on the field, and whoever hits it first gets it, meaning free falling for dangerous amounts of time is rewarded, although this mode is basically multiplayer only. You can play it single player, I did, it just makes the game easy mode. Is it better than the original? Not really. It has a bit more variety, but the basic gameplay is at best the same. The conversion to much weaker hardware also really harms the presentation. The game is noticeably less detailed. There's no animation for the parachute opening, which makes learning close timing more difficult as you have no visual indication. The planes are just lowercase t's, and the colors picked are shit brown, puke green, and traffic cone orange. It's really just an unpleasant set of colors. The simple intro song is gone, although the loss of details thankfully also killed the ambulances. The splat sound is much funnier than that horrific noise, I guess, which is a benefit, but the planes also sound worse to balance it out. It's just being a muffled grumbling. The game looks pretty standard for the Atari, realistically, but it's a massive step down, and there are at least a few games that looked a good step above Stickman on a pure blue backdrop like this game has, such as Indiana Jones. It's really made more striking by the fact that some of the more complex games like Pitfall look a lot better than this, when this game is as simple of a high-score arcade game as they come. Does this game have a legacy? It was on a few more compilations than its arcade counterpart, but no. Nobody remembers this game, if for no other reason than its incredibly mundane subject matter. Not that skydiving isn't cool, but doesn't make for a very good video game. It's kind of a coin toss on this one. The gameplay is just as passable as the original, but it has a little more variety. But the trade-off is the passable presentation of the original becoming visual and audio garbage. This version maybe edges out the other for variety very slightly, but neither is generally worth being remembered. Very simple games on the level of throwaway mini-games with nothing special or interesting, even compared to things that were fairly contemporary to it.